Today, we will be discussing if non-natural entities can purchase properties and what the benefits of those might be. So, Abe, tell us, can a non-natural body purchase a property?
So essentially, if one uses the term non-natural bodies or juristic entities, as one might say, you've got a couple of forms that are legally recognized in Namibia. You've got closed corporations under the Closed Corporations Act that are ultimately administered by BIPA. You've got companies in their various forms, ultimately under the Companies Act, also administered by BIPA. And then you've got trusts. Now, trusts are a bit of a they quasi-juristic in a sense, and it's quite legally complex exactly what term you might apply to them. And then partnerships, for example, aren't legal entities, but you can also register property in partnerships. Ultimately, at the end of the day, any closed corporation or company has got a legal personality, much like a natural person that's created legally. It's a legal construct. So a closed corporation can sue you and can be sued. It can own vehicles, it can own houses and everything. Subject, obviously, complying with the Closed Corporations Act. Same with companies. It can own houses, it can own farms, it can own mining licenses, anything like that. Subject to also compliance with the Companies Act. So ultimately, you have your directors of the company dealing with the property, or your members of the CC dealing with the property. In a case of a trust, and like I said, it's not technically a juristic entity, it's like quasi-juristic. You again have trusts being run by the Trust Administration Act. The new act came in last year, and it repealed the Trust Monies Protection Act, which was in effect for decades and decades, essentially. So a big change in landscape with trusts. They regulate it much better, but not regulated by BIPA, but by the Master of the High Court. So, to answer your question shortly, the Deeds Registries Act and the Deeds Office allows for you to register property in a number of things. Obviously natural persons or warm bodies, CCs, PTYs, trust, or a partnership, and you can actually in fact have them in a combination of those. So you can have a half share of a house owned by a natural person and a PTY, or a PTY or a CC. So any sort of combination of those you can also have. So the answer essentially is yes. They can also enjoy property rights, ultimately benefiting the people who have indirect ownership, which are
of that entity,
the shareholders or the members of that entity. Exactly.
And so you mentioned that there are different permutations that you can use to sort of purchase a property with these different juristic entities. Are there any benefits or disadvantages, benefits and or disadvantages that you would get from purchasing a property in these entities?
So if you had asked me that question, let's say a couple of months ago, the answer would have been entirely different. Previously, before the commencement of the new Transfer Duty Act of 2024, evidently if one had asked what was the benefit of a closed corporation owning properties and so on, it would have been very beneficial back then, because you would have avoided transfer duties essentially. The new act has come in and it's changed the landscape entirely. So let's just look at a closed corporation. Closed corporations currently, if you want to buy the member's interest in a closed corporation by registering an amended founding statement at BIPA, and that closed corporation owns residential property as defined in the new act, which is essentially a dwelling or an abode or an earth zone for residential, then you need to pay transfer duty on that change of member's interest. Appreciate though that the benefit of it hasn't completely been dissipated, in a sense that if the closed corporation owns commercial property, that is, let's say, an earth zone for office or light industrial or business generally, you essentially can do it business as usual back in the past, where you can take over the member's interest without paying transfer duty. So appreciate that this new act focuses on residential property, which essentially can be an earth or a sectional title unit that you use for residential purposes. So obviously the prevalence of closed corporations in our housing market that we used to all know is essentially no longer worth it, because with the new 1.1 million Namibian dollar exemption on transfer duty, it's much cheaper essentially to just take transfer out of the closed corporation into your own name, because these entities previously, because of their benefit, you could sustain the, let's say, holding costs annually. But now it doesn't make sense to have a closed corporation, and then you need to deal with various costs. You need an accounting officer, you need a secretarial service, all that type of thing. So you'll much rather just own it in your personal name. The other benefits of closed corporations and companies are treated exactly the same. So a sale of shares in a company that owns residential property, the same. You're going to pay transfer duty now. So, and stamp duty with companies, which has never been the case with closed corporations and is still not the case in terms of the new amendment. So it has just become much more expensive to have residential properties in these various entities. If you think holiday homes at the coast and so on, very luxury properties, high-end properties, it was much more beneficial having these in these entities, and I believe that will all stop now. So other than transfer duty saving and the various costs dealing with holding properties and so on, one of the other benefits, if you have property in juristic entities like closed corporations or companies, is obviously that they do offer limited liability. So they are separate from their shareholders, which can be people, or their members, which can be people. So obviously, by virtue of being a shareholder member, you are not ipso facto liable for the debts and obligations of those entities. So if you trade in them and so on, at least you know you're not personally liable. And obviously, if the balance sheet is right and the loan to value to banks is right, and you're not asked for a personal surety, there's instances where your CC can give you financial assistance by registering mortgage bonds and taking loans, and you as an individual are not personally liable for it. Although if it's a big loan, the bank will ask you for a personal surety, then you're essentially in the boat with your CC in terms of liability. And then I think the other entity that we can talk about is perhaps trusts. Now, as I said, trusts have recently undergone a bit of a change in terms of legislation. The Trust Administration Act of 2023 has come in. And trusts, because they are not separate juristic entities, to me don't have those classic benefits that closed corporations and companies have, like cost saving and that. The true benefit with a trust, and this is maybe not something banks always want to hear, but is more insolvency remoteness. It is a means of ensuring some of your most cherished assets can be housed somewhere that your creditors might not necessarily get to. So as a natural person, you might have signed personal sureties up to your neck essentially, and if those commercial endeavors go south, your creditors are going to come after you, and they can execute against your property. They can execute against members' interest in a closed corporation and sell it in execution. They can sell your shares in a company and sell it in execution. But what they cannot do is attach your beneficial interest in a trust, a discretionary trust that's not vested, in which might be some of your most crucial assets that are not hypothecated and encumbered and so on. So a trust classically is not to me, is not a cost-saving sort of entity to use. It's more of an insolvency remote entity to use, and an asset protection entity to guard against the commercial risks that we all go into every day, trying to pursue a business and just participating in capitalism, if I might say that. So those are, in short, essentially the benefits for me.
Quite a lot to digest from today's episode, huh? And to my viewers at home, you've heard what the gentleman has said. Are we going to purchase our properties in CCs, which is ideally almost going to become redundant from a residential perspective? Are we going to use a partnership? Are we going to use a company? Or are we going to use a trust? Thank you so much for your time. And to our viewers at home, see you next week.